In the classic Sonic series, the main goal is to get to the end of the act while collecting as many rings as possible. But what if we completely disregard this and instead try to collect none of the rings in any of the zones in the game? In today's video, we're going to answer the question, can you beat Sonic the Hedgehog without collecting a single ring? Before the challenge starts, we do need to set some ground rules. Firstly, one that's pretty obvious. If we collect a single ring in any act, we restart the act from the beginning. And if we find a level that doesn't have a single way to get to the end without collecting one ring, we lose the challenge. Secondly, we need to choose a character. Sonic doesn't work all too well when we're trying not to collect rings. If there's a really large gap that's full of rings, then there isn't much we can really do. Knuckles could also be a very good character for us to use for the challenge, but we'd need a type of wall to give altitude and Sonic 1 doesn't always have that. So we're going with Tails, even though I really hate playing as him. And lastly, we're going to be playing Classic Sonic Heroes, which is a ROM hack that contains Sonic 1 and 2 with a few minor changes. With all that said, let's start this challenge. We start off in Green Hill Zone, which really just gets you used to a lot of the aspects that the challenge has. Firstly, routing a specific route to take you without needing to forcibly take a ring can be extremely difficult. In Act 1, you can't take the downwards route because you'll get shot out the tunnel with so much force that you can't stop in time before Tails collects a ring. Instead, you have to go upwards. But what is just as hard is just staying alive in the first place. Remember, you have no rings, so once you get hit, it's over, and since checkpoints are commonly near some rings like a tunnel in Act 1, you most of the time have to start from the very beginning of the act. And Green Hill also introduces us to one of the saving graces we have in this challenge, the shield. See, because we can't get any rings, flying around with no shield is very dangerous because of bad nicks that could possibly be in the air. So the shield, while not being a very efficient solution because getting hit out of the sky would have you fall into rings anyway, is still a very good thing for us. Either way, Act 1 isn't all too difficult. You need to avoid enemies in the sky until you reach the shield, then fly to the upper path, fly above the rings, and then we do something that we'll be doing a lot of. Spin dashing as much as possible, then fly against the ceiling of the level, which for the sake of the video, we're gonna call fly boosting. For some reason, flying like this gives you a boost of speed, so it actually helps us pass over massive areas. And with that, we pass Act 1. Act 2 is even easier than that, there's a fewer amount of buzz bombers and less interruptions to beat the level. And Act 3, well, it's somehow even easier than that. And around the middle section of the act, there's a speed shoe monitor, so taking it and dodging the rings will bring next the checkpoint. From here, all we need to do is fly boost, and with the added speed shoe boost, we fly through the entire rest of the level. And that's where we meet the boss. Boss fights aren't necessarily going to be a problem directly. There's no rings in any of the bosses, so once we reach the boss, we can play the game as usual. Problem is what they can do. Obviously, they can kill you, which could send you back to the beginning of a very difficult level. This is why when you're around bosses, we kinda need to make sure we defeat them in one hit in order not to waste any much time. So, for the Green Hill boss, we need to make sure that once the screen locks, we move over to the left side of the screen, because we could potentially just land on Eggman and die. But other than that, nothing else happened in Green Hill Zone, and with that, we can move on to Marble Zone. This zone was really easy, but trust me, what's about to follow is some of the hardest gameplay I've ever had to accomplish in a Sonic game. Marble Zone starts to make this challenge harder. Because we're often in enclosed spaces, and rings are generally closer to us than they usually are, we need to have a lot more flight control. For example, in this place in the beginning of Act 1, you need to carefully fly without touching the ground except for when the machines lift up, and enemies become a bit more of a problem. But honestly, if you just play the way the level design tells you to and move somewhat slowly to avoid any rings that show up, you're pretty good to go. It's Act 2 that brings in the first real problem we'll have in this challenge. You see, at the very beginning of Act 2, there's a set of 2 rings that block the entrance to the rest of the level. In the base game, this is where the run would actually end because there's no way to scale up or bypass these 2 rings. I even tried tapping the right key as little as possible to see if Tails would somehow clip or squeeze between the spaces, but no luck there. Luckily, in Classic Sonic Heroes, the area above this same wall makes this extremely easy. All we need to do is scale up the wall until we find the crack that will allow us to bypass all of the underground section. But because of what is next, this became the second longest amount of time I spent trying to beat a level, because Act 3 is hard. The routing isn't too difficult on its own, we take the shortcut and skip some sections of the level, but the problem I have is the route I was taking didn't have any shields on them, meaning I was constantly dying to pads in the air, spikes coming out the wall, and even lost to the boss a multitude of times. But it was pretty simple, and all it took was a matter of time. So we move on to Spring Yard Zone. Spring Springyard Zone is actually somehow even easier than Green Hill Zone, and I'm not even joking. This zone introduces us to new tech we'll be using, which is a variation of the Fly Boost. The Fly Boost on its own is extremely powerful. It lasts a while and it can actually help bypass zones which would otherwise be completely impossible. But there's one main thing that stops a Fly Boost, and it's pretty simple: a wall. So how do we counter this? Well, it's actually pretty simple. We just get over the wall. This will be called wall fly boosting, and even though the method takes a lot more conditioning for it to actually be possible, it still is very overpowered. In Act 1 alone, we get a combination of this newfound power with Speed Shoes, which absolutely breaks Springyard Act 1. Since there's another wall nearby, we can rest on that wall and recharge a full power spin dash in order for us to fly through the entire rest of the act if done properly. If you don't get enough speed from the spin dash, you'll end up over here with the blocks and the buzz bombers, which is still pretty simple to do, as all you need to do is dodge the buzz bombers attacks and it's a smooth sailing to the end of the act. And in Act 2, for whatever reason, there's a random set piece at the very beginning of the level that can, for whatever reason, take you off the screen and make this level easily beatable in just over 30 seconds. As long as you take breaks on the other ceilings you can find throughout the level, then you can easily land at the ending section and fly very carefully along the roof, Big Chop, before you end the zone on the upper section. So far, things have been relatively simple and easy, but the third act of Springyard is when this game really starts to test my critical thinking and problem solving skills. You see, towards the beginning of Act 3, there's a section with a ball chain and 5 rings. These 5 rings completely obstruct the path of the player, and there's no set piece that allows you to go over the ceiling, and there's a wall right ahead if we take the upper route. This means that the only way to progress to the next part of the act is through this place. I originally tried to do something close to what you do in Springyard Act 2, where you fly really close to the ground and then attempt to fly downwards, but that yielded no results either. So was this it? Could this be the ending of the challenge? Well, I certainly thought so, and so I started digging around just about everywhere for anything that could help me. I saw a ring box and invincibility monitor, and just as I was about to call it off, I found a flame shield. This means we can take a hit, but really that doesn't make much sense. If we really wanted to be immune, we could always use the invincibility monitor, right? Well, actually no, because we're taking the shield so that we can get hit. Not long after, I started thinking of a way to bypass this obstacle. Could it be to spin dash and then try to get on top of the level and then wall fly boost over? Or is this really it? Well, turns out, when you get the shield and just stand in the right place when the ball chain comes up, you get hit and phase through all the rings. It's a lot harder than it looks really. You need absolute precision, and every time you fail, you need to restart the level. So yeah, this part is completely possible. Moving on, we follow the normal route until we get into these set of blocks, jump out of bounds and start flying, spin dash jump onto the next ceiling, get to the edge, and then wall fly boost until you get to the boss, which can be quite annoying, but it's nothing too difficult. And with that, we move on to Labyrinth Zone. Labyrinth Zone is kind of a really ridiculous situation because out of all the zones in Sonic 1, Labyrinth Zone's rings aren't really all that hard to dodge. The hardest rings to avoid here are ones you don't know are above you until it's too late, because they're almost always tucked away in the corner, and there's not even a ring set after a jet stream at all. That being said, there's absolutely no chance of fly boosting or wall fly boosting, so if there's anything impossible, we're gonna have to get creative again. Act 1 is really easy, taking the normal route and moving relatively slowly is all you need to do to clear the act. In Act 2, however, we reach another really weird roadblock, and this one's kinda silly. In the middle of the act, you enter this area where there's a button you need to press in order to progress in the level. The only problem is that the button you need to press is covered by a ring box. Now, this just seems impossible. There's no other way around it, and it's not like we're glitching through the ground or anything like that. So, how do you pass this section? Well, the way we do it is actually one of the most absurd things I've ever seen. It turns out if you line yourself right next to the ring box, the hitbox of the button is just big enough for you to just press the button without hitting the ring box at all. This doesn't even work in any other version of Sonic 1 other than classic Sonic Heroes, so we just so happen to get 2 different instances where being alive at all is just due to classic Sonic Heroes itself. Moving on, we finished Act 2 pretty easily. Act 3 is even easier as the fast way to get through without collecting any rings is identical to the way I would take normally, and the boss fight itself doesn't even have any rings, so we beat the boss and move on to Starlight. Despite this being the second last zone in the entire challenge, somehow Starlight Zone Act 1 and 2 were so easy that they are actually somehow not just as easy as the normal routes that one would take, but somehow even easier than that. Back in my Sonic 1 review, I stated that Starlight Zone has such a broad level design that it ends up going to the bottom of the screen and the top as well. And from Springyard Zone, you should know that wall fly boosting is extremely overpowered. So from the beginning, we followed the upper route, going somewhat decently slow until we dodge this fire and cross these rotating platforms. Then we get up on this conveniently placed extremely helpful slope, spin dash, jump into the stars, and then fly until we stop, land down on the ground, and then finish the act. In Act 2, it's even more simpler than that. We already start extremely close to the top of the map, so we fly upwards until we see a speed shoe monitor, collect it, and ramp up against another conveniently placed extremely helpful slope. And then we can fly through the entire rest of the stage in just 22 seconds. Starlight Act 3, however, is the hardest level in this entire challenge, not necessarily because it's impossible, but because it's very difficult. For some reason, in this zone, in particular, there's a wall above the level, meaning wall fly boosting is useless, so we go to the lower route and it's hard. There are bombers everywhere, which become even more of a problem when you're with no rings. There's these fireballs that seem to show up at the worst possible time, and there's even a section towards the end of the act where there are a set of 5 bombers with rings below you, so you fly and dodge multiple little pellets that will insta-kill you, all while being pushed by a fan. And after all that, we get to the boss, which can be surprisingly difficult, because we don't know if the hitbox detection will switch up on us, and force us to die even though there shouldn't be a reason to. Anyway, after we finally defeat Starlight's boss, we move on to the final zone of the game, Scrap Brain. Pretty easily, we come up to a big problem, the vents. Throughout Scrap Brain Act 1, there are different vents seen throughout the level, and all of them contain rings in them, so automatically, we have to ring out all of these. The problem is, there's no real way to get to the ending of the act without one. If we go to the lowest path, this way starts off block right rings, so that's not a viable option. If we move a bit up, it's also block right rings at the get-go as well. If we both move to the higher platform, we get some rings a bit later in the tunnel, and the highest route has the same problems as the lower ones. This is a serious problem because, like I said, these are the only ways we can possibly finish the act. On the upper route, I saw that there was a monster crawling back and forth. If it could hit me, then could my invincibility frames help me to bypass the 5 rings just like it did in Springyard Act 3? Well, it turns out that it's only the initial getting hit that allows you to not touch rings, not the iframes themselves. I even considered trying to get a lightning shield and losing it, so that the rings would somehow move out of the way by the magnet property, but that didn't work either. I tried to get hit by the flame at the very beginning of the level in hopes that maybe the iframes would work there, but they didn't either. And so it seems that this is the end of the challenge. And yeah, it is. It's a real shame too, because as a last effort ditch to save this, I even looked up a level map, and Act 2 and Act 3 seem to be completely possible. But I guess that's that. To answer the question, no, you can't beat Sonic the Hedgehog without collecting a single ring. The absolute least you could do is 5 rings, by the upper route here. When I started this challenge, I had already suspected that this won't exactly be so easy. But honestly, even though we couldn't complete the challenge, I still see this as an absolute win. Thanks so much for watching, make sure you subscribe on your way out, and have a good day or night wherever you are.